Hello and welcome to part 2 of Black Ships Before Troy. We're going to start with chapter 4, Single Combat. So as always, I recommend following along to read the chapter and then going and working on your packet. And as always, if you have questions, let us know. When the 12th day came, Zeus the Thunderer was once again on the high crest of Olympus, and Thetis went to him, begging that he would bring about a victory for the Trojans, that the High King and all the Greek war host might sorely feel the loss of Achilles, her son, from among their fighting ranks. And though he did not really wish to, Zeus gave her the promise that she asked. So, if you recall from the last chapter, at the end, the High King Agamemnon really insults Achilles. He takes Briseis, and Achilles not only is going to sit out for the fighting, but thanks to his mom, Thetis, he's going to get Zeus to fight for the Trojans. Now again, you might still be learning names, and that's okay, but the important thing to know is the king of the gods, Zeus, not being on your side is not good. That's going to be really hard for the Greeks. The father of the gods considered how long the thing should be done. And that night, he sent a false dream to Agamemnon as he lay sleeping in his timber hall. The dream took the shape of the wise old Nestor, who stood beside the High King's bed, and told him, "O King and Lord of Kings, make the war host ready for battle. For if you attack Troy this coming day, Zeus promises to you victory, and only grief and loss to the Trojan people." When Agamemnon woke and saw the gray dawn light standing in his doorway, he remembered his dream and was great with hope. But as the light strengthened, he remembered that dreams can lie. He was always one whose mood swung him first one way and then the other. And when he rose, instead of donning his war gear and ordering out his heralds with the call to arms, he put on his robe and mantle, and took his scepter of olive wood bound with gold, and summoned the kings and captains to hear his dream and advise him on it. His own doubts spread to the men listening to him, and there was no eager cry for battle, but only men looking doubtfully at each other. So, High King of the Greeks, Agamemnon, smart dude. Zeus is actively trying to trick him. Sends him a dream, says, yeah, now is a great time to attack, go for it. And that would actually be a really bad idea. Thankfully, Agamemnon's smart, so instead of just charging into battle, he has a council. He's like, okay, here's this dream, but I'm not so sure. What do you guys think? So they're all kind of looking at each other like, I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't. Then the High King, bottom of 23, then the High King suggested a mad thing. He said that he would test the temper of the army. He would summon them all together and tell them that the siege had already dragged on too long, and the time had come when they should run their ships down into the water and burn the camp behind them and set sail for Greece. If the warriors took him at his word, however, their leaders were to turn them back before they reached the ships, and he would try and put some means to put fresh heart into them. But the siege had indeed dragged on too long. The warriors' hopes had sunk low, and they were weary for their own homes, and their wives and children left too long behind. As soon as they heard what Agamemnon had to say, they rose up like a sea before the west wind, and shouting joyfully, made for the ships with the dust rolling up in a cloud behind them, and their captains as eager as all the rest. So, excuse me, this is interesting. Agamemnon's like, okay, ignore the dream. I don't think we're going to go fight. Instead, let's test the temper, or let's test how the army is feeling. The High King's plan is to tell them, we're packing up. We're setting sail for home. We have already been here too long. If you remember from the last chapter, they've been here for over 9 years. So they miss their home, they miss their kids, they miss their home foods, they miss their home people. There's a lot of reasons to want to go home. So instead of doing what they want, right, the High King wants the soldiers to be like, no, we're going to stay and fight. As soon as they say we're leaving, they're all like, heck yeah, and so they take off. But that's a problem, because we're not actually leaving. Only Odysseus stood firm, shouting to the chieftains that the High King did but jest, right? He was just kidding. And a shameful thing it would be to leave the siege now, when they had spent so long upon it. Taking in his hand the royal scepter to use as a staff, he turned to Cattle Dog and herded the warriors back to the gathering place. They returned at last, though in an ugly humor, puzzled and without heart. But only one of them protested, an ugly and bandy-legged fellow called Thersites, who jumped out before the rest and began a jeering speech, insulting the leaders and telling the war host to run away, for they were not worth following. Odysseus, knowing that he must be silenced quickly, and the mood of the war host must be changed, took and beat him with the scepter until the blood came, and Thersites cried like a baby. Odysseus flung him down, laughing at the sight he made. Those nearest joined in the laughter, and the laughter spread out to the farthest fringes of the army, where men did not know what they laughed at. The warriors hitched up their weapons and cheered. Odysseus went. He and white-haired Nestor bade them make ready for battle in the name of the High King. Okay, so basically what just happened. High King is like, hey, let's pretend that we're going home. Let's trick them so that they're like, no, we're going to stay and fight for you, High King. That doesn't happen. Everybody wants to go home. They start running for the ships. Only one soldier, Odysseus. He's important. Only one soldier named Odysseus is like, y'all, he was just kidding. The High King did not mean for us to go home. Please come back. So he rounds back up all the soldiers. And he notices that there's one guy. He's not important. You don't need to know his name. But basically one guy's like, you know what? No, screw this. Let's go home. We don't need to be here. This isn't fair. The king sucks. The chieftains suck. And so to make an example out of him, Odysseus beats the crap out of him, points and laughs, and makes an example. And everyone goes along with it and is like, haha, yeah, what a coward. We're going to fight for Greece. So thankfully, thanks to this one guy, Odysseus, the Greek army is now fresh heart. They are ready to fight. So, company by company, starting back on 25. Following their kings and chiefs and captains, the Greeks harnessed the captured horses to their chariots and swept out over the plain in great wheeling masses, like cranes sweeping in from distant lands to their own marshes at mating time. And the Trojans, taking heart from the knowledge that Achilles had turned his back on the fighting, came pouring out from their city to meet them. For the first time in all the long years of the siege, the two great war hosts came face to face. And the Trojans, So basically what that means is in 9 years, it's so far been siege warfare. The Trojans have stayed inside Troy. They said, we're not coming outside. You guys can just stay out and attack random cities around us. We're good right here. But for the first time in 9 years, just now, they actually come out of the city and they are fighting face to face. So this is pretty big. They checked, fronting each other in two long menacing battle lines, and out from the Trojan mass into the clear space between swaggered Paris himself, a spotted panther skin across his shoulder, and in his hands 2 bronze-headed spears and his great bow. He shouted a challenge to the Greek lines, to any warrior who would come out and meet him in single combat. Then Menelaus, the rightful husband of Helen, was glad as a lion is on his kill, and leapt from his chariot. Top of page 26. His armor flashing in the sun. But Paris, seeing who came against him, felt his heart shrink within him from shame as much as fear, and fell back into the ranks of the Trojan host behind him. There Hector found him, and tongue-lashed him in scorn for his cowardice, and managed to drive something of courage into him again. And while the courage lasted, he offered a formal bargain to end the war one way or the other by fighting Menelaus. A fight to the death. If Paris were killed, Helen, with all her jewels upon her, would be returned to her first husband and her own people. If Menelaus died, she should remain with him and the Trojans. The Greeks would return without her over the seaways and lands in which they came. The Greeks agreed to this, and so that the thing might be acceptable to the gods, Hector sent back into Troy for 2 lambs for sacrifice. While they were brought, Paris put on borrowed armor, for he had not come armed for battle, gleaming breastplate and leg guards, and great helmet with a high nodding horsehair crest. And throughout the mighty war hosts of Greece and Troy, every man took off his own armor, for the sun grew hot, and settled down, leaning on his shield to watch in comfort. Meanwhile, Helen, who was at home among her women and weaving a great purple cloak on her loom, heard of the coming fight between Paris and her marriage lord. She left her weaving and flung a veil over her head and hurried to the roof of the nearest gate tower. King Priam was there already, and some of his elders with him, looking out over the plain and the two great armies gathered there. So this is interesting. Right now, in this moment, we have an opportunity to end the war forever. Instead of two armies, we essentially have the two men who are fighting over Helen. You have her original husband, Menelaus, and then you have her new man that she ran away with, Paris. Essentially, Hector, who is Paris's brother, he says, no. This is your fault, Paris. You stole Helen when she did not belong to you. So go fight this man, and whoever wins, wins, and the war will be over. Now, obviously, we have a lot more to read, so the war is not going to end. Something's going to happen. So you can kind of make your own predictions, right? Nobody's going to die? They're both going to die? Are they going to be able to duel? But we're going to take a second and we're going to look at Helen, because we haven't really heard much about her except how beautiful she is. So she disguises herself and she wants to go watch this duel happen between her two men. And seeing her come, the old men murmured among themselves that there had been no shame all this while in fighting to keep so fair a lady. But now it would be a fine thing for Troy if she were to go back to her first lord and be with her own people. But Priam, who had always been kind to her, saw her flinch at their words, put out his hand and draw her to him. "Dear child," he said, "I do not blame you for what has come to pass. It is the will of the high gods that has brought this evil between your people and mine." But Helen wept and said, "Always you have dealt gently with me. But I wish that I had died before I left my marriage lord and my babe, shameless as I am, and came with Paris across the sea to bring so much sorrow upon us all." So we finally get to see how Helen is feeling. She really did love Paris, and we can understand that she left Menelaus for love, but she clearly feels bad, and she clearly never meant to start a war. She feels guilty, because in a way, this is her fault too, because they're fighting over her. And so you have these Trojans that are like, well, maybe it'd be better if she just went ahead and went back home so we can stop this war. And that's got to be painful for her to hear. She's basically saying, I wish I'd died before I'd made this choice. So a lot of guilt there. And whether or not you feel bad for her is up to you. She would have covered her face and drawn back from the edge of the roof, but Priam held her at his side, asking her the name of this one and that among the Greek heroes to turn her thoughts a little in another way. And so they remained for a while, side by side, looking down. Below, in the open space between the armies, a rough altar had been set up. The two lambs were sacrificed, and a great oath was taken by the leaders of both sides to abide by the outcome of the combat, whatever it might be. Then a square fighting ground was marked off, and while the two champions stood facing each other, two wooden tablets, one marked for Paris and one marked for Menelaus, were put into a helmet, and Hector shook them up to decide who should cast the first spear. Paris's lot flew out on the trampled ground. There was a deep breath from those who near enough to see. Paris! Paris has the first throw! Paris drew back on his spear and made his cast, but his spear point was blunted on the boss of Menelaus' shield and fell uselessly away. Then Menelaus cried out in a mighty voice to the father of the gods, "Great Zeus, grant me my rightful vengeance on this man who did me foul wrong, even while he ate my salt and slept beneath my roof." And he in turn made his cast in with all the force of his wrongs behind it. The spear point drove clean through Paris' shield and breastplate and gashed the fine stuff of his tunic, but did not so much as nick the skin beneath. For the Trojan flung herself sideways just in time. With a roar of fury, Menelaus rushed upon him with his great sword upswung, but the blade, slashing at the bronze comb of his helmet, shattered into 4 pieces that spun away, bright and blinking in the sunlight. Menelaus threw the useless hilt aside and leapt upon Paris like a panther on its kill, grasped him by the horse's crest, and began to drag him back toward the Greek lines. But Aphrodite caused the helmet strap to burst apart from under Paris's chin, so that Menelaus found himself suddenly with a great crested helmet empty in his hands. He whirled about and flung it into the midst of his own warriors, but when he turned again to finish his enemy, the Trojan prince was nowhere to be seen. Aphrodite had flung a cloak of invisibility about him and swept him back to his own house, safe within the high palace courts of Priam, his father. While Menelaus went raging up and down, seeking his enemy, warriors of the Greek host shouted for victory. For by right of the bargain between them and the Trojans, Helen was now theirs again. And with her on board, they could run their ships down from the timeline and sail at long last for their homes. But Helen, with her hand in the old king's, still looking down from the roof of the Scand Gate Tower, thought the same. But Aphrodite went to her there, no one else seeing her, come save as a flicker in the air like the darting of a swallow, and told her, "Come now, back to your own house. Paris, your lord, is there in the great chamber, and calling for you." "Paris is no longer any lord of mine. That time is past, and I will not go for all of his calling," Helen said. But the goddess of love was not so easily refused, and her brow grew dark for all her beauty. "That is proudly spoken, but take care that the love I have shown you until now does not turn to hate. It would be no hard thing to turn the hearts of the Greeks as well as the Trojans against you, and then between the two you might indeed find most cruelly the death that you have cried out for." Then Helen was afraid. She pulled her veil across her face and followed the goddess back to her house. In the high chamber, Paris sat on the edge of the bed, unarmed and looking as though he had come from flutes and dancing rather than a fight, save for the red wheel of helmet strap on his neck. And standing before him, fierce and bitter, she said, "So, you've come back from the fighting ground. Hear now my greeting to you. It is this, that I wish you had died out there between the war hosts, at the hand of my true marriage lord, who is a better man than you will ever be." Paris got up and held out his arms. "Nay, honey sweet, those are hard words to a man new back from battle. There will be other times between me and Menelaus, and meanwhile, do not be forgetting the love that I have given to you all these years. Do not be forgetting the sworn bargain that makes me wife to Menelaus again, and no longer woman of yours." Helen flashed upon him and would have turned away. But Aphrodite knew that if Helen of the fair cheeks went back to her own people, the long war would be over, and Troy the loser. Her own promise to Paris would have gone wailing down the wind, and she would look foolish in all the eyes of the gods and have to bear the mockery of a Hera and Athene. So she cast her magic upon Helen, so that she saw him standing there with his arms held out, as he'd stood 10 years ago among the Spartan olive trees, with his ship waiting in the harbor. And bitterly, but not able to help herself, she went into his arms again and remained with him in the high chamber of Troy. All right, so that's single combat. The war could have ended, but because of the meddling of the gods, the all-powerful goddess Aphrodite takes Paris away from the battlefield, saves him, prevents him from being killed, and she threatens and puts magic spells on Helen to make her go back to Paris. Because Helen was done. Helen was like, "I can't believe I've caused all this pain. I'm going home. This is not worth it. I don't love this guy anymore." But because of Aphrodite, she goes back to him. And so the war is going to continue. So that's where we'll pick up with the women of Troy. The women of Troy is going to focus on 3 ladies. First, you have one of the other goddesses. You have Athena. Then you also have Helen of the fair cheeks, who's technically a Trojan woman there. But then we're also going to meet a new lady, Andromache, who is Hector's wife. So be on the lookout for that. And if you have any questions about this packet right here, please come see us because we can help.